Oh man, $13 a day. I'm gonna be a Bitcoin millionaire by the end of the week. Google. Now Google, I used to look at it as my homepage. I used to look at it as a search engine. Now I look at it as an entity that has rejected me, has made me feel dejected, distraught, down and out. Because I went to an interview, got rejected, and ironically it makes me respect them a little bit more because at least they were smart enough to know that I wasn't smart enough. Now you may have two questions. The first question being, how did I get a Google interview? To answer that question, the answer would be blind luck because I basically applied to any job I saw that was relatively interesting at Google, threw my resume in there. I guess a couple of times the resume flew past the shredder and actually ended up on a recruiter's desk and they reached out to me. I have no idea what makes a recruiter choose to reach out to me as opposed to someone else. No clue. I don't really work at a quote-unquote FANG company at the moment. I don't really have any experience that I would think is like super amazing, like in terms of like AI or machine learning. A bulk of my experience has been back-end development with a focus on microservices. So, just to put it out there that I did do a good job. I've had a good career so far. It's been, 3 years, 2.5, 3 years. Like I said the word career when I graduated college like 3 years ago. But so far so good. And then the second question is, how do you know I'm legit? How do you know that I'm not just on the internet right now LARPing, pretending I had a Google interview and that I have a million IQ and that I'm the one who actually rejected Google and that I didn't really want the offer? Well, the proof is in the pudding. I made 2 posts on Blind, basically relieving all my salt and all my frustration, basically complaining about the problem. I'm not gonna lie, there was one problem on the interview that blew my mind, and I'm so happy that people were basically saying that's a really unfair problem to see in an interview, but it is what it is. Anything is fair when it comes to the interview. So in terms of my interview experience and how it went is basically, unfortunately for me and my timing, Google reached out to me at the tail end of me applying to other jobs, and I already had offers in hand. So it's kind of awkward because I really, not to say I don't care about Google, I absolutely think that they're a good company, but they came so late in the process and I already had stuff set up that I didn't want to jeopardize my other offers by just putting all my eggs in one basket and being like, okay guys, I know that the Google offer is probably going to take a month or so to go through. I was able to extend my deadlines enough to do the interview, but it probably wouldn't have been enough to extend it had I have gotten an offer. So I ended up basically just saying to myself, I'm going to do this Google interview. I'm not going to prepare a lot because if I did that, I'm going to lose my other offers and then Google's going to be the only option I have, which isn't necessarily smart because the interview isn't exactly a cakewalk. So I didn't want to do that. So I made the decision that I would go into this Google interview with not much preparation other than a weekend's worth of studying, or 2 weekends worth before the onsite. So basically the recruiter reached out to me. I filled out some forms, some information, what I'm interested in. And then from there, I basically told them I already have some offers in hand and I'm also doing another interview right now, a final interview. And I'd like to, if possible, do the phone interviews as fast as possible. So okay, all right, no problem. When are you available? Blah, blah, blah. Ends up 3 days later, I had the phone interview. Now, again, I didn't have a super long time to study. Realistically, I usually try to take at least a month to prepare for these interviews. I have been preparing for other interviews. I was preparing for an Amazon interview, Facebook interview earlier, a Dropbox interview. So I've been studying on and off, so it's not like I didn't do any studying, but I did not do leak code tag questions for Google, which probably would have helped me. But I only mentioned that to say that you probably should do that. You shouldn't have done what I did, although for me I think it was the best thing I did in that situation. So for the phone interview, what I decided to do in terms of preparation is basically just try to focus on a couple of problems just to refresh myself. I know one thing that the recruiter shared with me that ended up being decent in terms of resources is this Google Tech Dev Guide, where if you actually go through it, they have data structures in an algorithm section. And if you go through and filter it based off what you're interested in, you can actually find past interview questions where you can see just general algorithms and data structures questions. This was actually pretty useful. I actually kind of wish I knew about this earlier. I never knew about this until this interview, which is a little weird because I usually look for practice problems. I ended up doing, what is that website? Codelity, I think, or not Code Signal. I ended up doing that just because they have a bunch of problems, and I'm not gonna lie, as dumb as it sounds, they have a nice UI. So when I submit something and I see the confetti, I feel accomplished. So I'm surprised I never found this site. It actually has some decent resources. So from this site, I got a couple of problems that I ended up doing, like valid word squares. I know one problem was decode string, which is kind of like a typical recursive problem where you basically want to maintain some type of state and do certain items based off of the flow of the problem. And I feel like this is a pretty good problem. This, as well as some parentheses problems I found from this guy's post on LeetCode. His name is Clayton J. Wong. I think that's his real name. I honestly don't know. I just know I found this post and thought it was pretty useful. He basically kind of details his preparation for his Google L5. He ended up getting an offer. For me, this position was was L4. And I honestly don't know how Google's levels work, to be completely honest. Like, I never told the recruiter, like, oh, I want to be L4, L5, L3, whatever. They just said, like, this is the position, this is how it's going to look, prepare for it. So the only reason I mention that is, like, I have 3 years of experience, and I've heard people with, like, 5 years, 6 years, 7, even, like, 10 years being offered, like, L4 or L5. I don't know if that's a good thing for me or a bad thing for me. I don't know if I should have done, like, a lower level one. I have no idea. Point being, my interview was an L4, this person's interview was an L5, and I chose to kind of go through his study sheet and his examples just to have some type of a rubric to go along with. And I basically just went through and did all these different problems just to do them, just to have my kind of like, not really to like guess what the problems are going to be, but just to have an idea of what I would expect and try to do it. I will say, I don't know if you're the same as me. I mean, everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. I was really happy because during this time, like shortly before and during, I became a lot better with graph-based algorithms and graph items in terms of like Dijkstra and topological sort, which, you know, it can be super easy, but also confusing. For me, it was confusing in the past, but throughout this year, I've incrementally have gotten better with certain algorithms and certain data structures. For me personally, right now, I would say my biggest pain point and weakness would be dynamic programming. Sometimes I see the recurrence relation, sometimes I don't. Either way, you probably want to focus on what you're weak on, but at the same time realize that, like, not every question is going to be a dynamic programming question. For me, I think I may have had one dynamic programming question, maybe, but I didn't use the dynamic approach just because I didn't see it. So, you know, maybe I'm just incompetent and don't know it. But basically, I went through this study guide, and before the phone interview, I basically did everything that was related to his phone interview section, as well as like round 1 and round 2. I was on site. It didn't take too long. I mean, I basically did this after work. I think it took like 3 days after work, and then like one Saturday to go through up to round 2. And it was at this point that I kind of felt like I was going to fail the phone screen because I didn't study that much, and I was like, all right, this is Google, so you know they're about to drain me on the phone screen. But the phone screen actually ended up being pretty good. It was pretty much 2 LeetCode medium problems. One was using a hash set. The other one was using I think it was a map and just like state with a string. It wasn't anything crazy. Like, it wasn't anything dynamic programming related. It wasn't anything that was like a LeetCode hard. And even the interviewer said, he's like, okay, the point of this interview is not for it to be super hard. We just want to see if you can code. Like, we just want to see if you're even worth the time to go to an onsite. And I'm like, all right, well, here we go. So it was pretty pleasant, but I will say that, you know, your mileage may vary, and some people get LeetCode hard questions on their phone interview. Some people get LeetCode easy. And the only reason I say LeetCode hard or LeetCode easy is just to, I don't know, I'd assume if you've been preparing for interviews, you know what LeetCode is. If you don't, I recommend you check it out. It's probably a good source. It's almost like if you've ever taken math classes and you have all those different math exercises or discrete structures, you have all those different problems to do. It's kind of like that. It's a pretty good resource just to do different problems and just test your knowledge. I would recommend you try to focus on what you're weak on and not go crazy down the memorization route, because no matter how much you memorize, you're not going to remember things properly. But with that being said, that was the way I approached the phone interview. I just did a bunch of random study problems just to kind of get in the mood of that phone interview. So after the phone interview, I was surprised. I did well, and they were like, all right, this looks good. You're going to have the onsite. The onsite is going to be 5 rounds, 4 coding rounds, and 1 behavioral round, which is a little bit different than what I'm used to. A lot of the interviews I've done has been 3 coding, 1 system design, 1 behavioral, but whatever. I didn't really care. I was like, okay. The onsite was scheduled for a week after my phone interview because, again, I had offers. I was moving on my deadlines, and I was kind of in a rush. And again, my primary motivating factor to doing this was kind of like to get that connection with Google, have a good rapport, and I feel like I did good enough where they'd think of me in the future. I mean, I'm not saying I was a rock star, because if I was, I would have gotten an offer. But I think I did decent enough where it's like I didn't, do so terrible that they're like, all right, this guy's just not even worth our time. So anyway, going into the onsite. Now for the onsite, I honestly felt like I wasn't expecting it to the onsite phase, and I was like, damn, like I'm really like I'm just rushing. Like I didn't feel good leading up to the onsite because I wanted to do more like Google tagged questions, because one thing that they mentioned that they say is different, and after doing the interview I have to agree, is that they have a larger emphasis on probability and statistics, and they also have a larger emphasis on mathematics. Now, your interview may vary. Some people have taken the Google interview and they're like, wow, this was so easy. How could anyone fail this? And then some people have taken it and been like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. Let me see if I can actually find that post. Oh, no, I can't find it. But there was some guy who, like, on Blind, like, if you ever want to, like, feel anxious, just go to Team Blind and listen to the way people talk about companies, where they're like, oh my God, I went to the Google interview and some guy, like, shot me in the face and said I'm an idiot. And you're like, oh my God, am I going to get shot in the face? Like, you get scared because other people have terrible experiences. But there's people who have had like ridiculous problems, and then people who have had ridiculously easy problems. So, your mileage may vary. For me, it was kind of a mixed bag, because my first question for the interview was something that was extremely heavily based on mathematics. I really was not expecting that. I've someone, and it required not only mathematics, it required a knowledge of geometry as well as calculus with vectors. It wasn't anything crazy. It's like if you ever taken vector calculus, it's like basic, like you would just need to know relationships of lines, and to know if they're orthogonal or perpendicular in order to make certain decisions. But I don't know, man. Like from my own personal perspective, and I know some people have said this, like on Blind, they said that it's kind of like a bad interview question. And I know for me, like even on looking at the lead code question, I found that after the fact, people are like, yo, this is so unfair. Like, how is this in an interview? I felt the same way, because what I ended up doing is that for that first round, I basically took an algebraic approach because I didn't see the relationship to calculus. If I had a little bit more time, maybe I would have, but honestly, it was just like so ambiguous. There was no context given. It was just basically like, all right, here's a bunch of information, find some other information based off these points on a graph, and there you go. Like literally any point on a graph can be provided. It can be duplicates. It can be correct input, incorrect input, and I was like, damn, this is a very, very, very data-intensive problem. And the problem really, when you think about it, it broke down to organizing the data as 90% of it, and then 10% was just doing the mathematical components behind it. But if I had to rate this problem, I definitely would give it a low score, just because of the fact that there was no point in time where they told you, hey, you should probably brush up on calculus for this or geometry for this. And even if they did, realistically, like geometry and calculus are such gigantic topics, maybe I would have focused on like just basically integrals and derivatives, and not on the dot product portion. Same thing with geometry. Maybe I would have focused on like circles instead of what this asks. I think it was related to triangles. Either way, I was unprepared for this question, and I did terrible on it, unfortunately, because I don't know. I mean, if you've never seen the problem before, I gave the mathematical solution that I had, where I made the assumption that lines are parallel, which isn't correct. And I basically coded up like 70% of the problem. But at the end of the day, I have no idea. I feel like people who are going to solve this problem are either A, extremely well versed in mathematics and have been studying it recently, or B, people who saw the problem on LeetCode memorize the formula, because it's literally just, it's like the usual stuff you do with parallelograms. I don't know. I feel like it was more of a math question than a programming question in my opinion, but whatever, I'm not Google. So then for the second question, this second question was also pretty hard, but it was a little bit more palpable. It was a little bit more easier to digest. It was kind of related to permutations, and basically doing certain operations on these permutations. I don't know if there was a more optimal method to go along with this, but I basically took the route of just basically getting permutations and doing the operation on those permutations, which ended up being around n factorial time. For this problem, I'm not going to lie, I kind of was shaken up from the first problem because I had done so poorly, and I was like, damn, like this is like off to a terrible start. And I was kind of a little bit shaken up, and for the second problem, I did better. I actually gave a full solution. I explained a little bit more, but even that, I feel like I had to explain a lot to my interviewer because I was doing things that he didn't really like agree, like not to say he didn't agree with me, but he wasn't seeing what I was seeing, and I was explaining it to him and doing my best, and I think we got to the point where eventually I did explain it to him, but it was pretty obvious that whatever solution I presented was something that I actually thought up of, and didn't think of the optimal solution. And I know people will say, well, it's like, oh, when you're in an interview, it's about expressing your thoughts and da-da-da. I feel like that's the biggest cap you can ever put on your head. Like, if you can think like your interviewer, they're going to love you. Like, they're going to understand you more, they're going to love you more, and it's basically going to be something that is, like, way easier. And even for that first problem, like, how I took the algebraic approach, like, maybe, like, I had to explain that to the interviewer, too, because probably in his head, he's like, okay, this is an obvious calculus implementation, whereas I'm using algebra. So, either way, first problem, not great. Second problem was decent, but not really, anything that blows anyone out of the water, and really was like ended up being like a light do not hire, meaning like basically like I was on, like the interview was on the fence, but he decided on don't hire. And then at this point, by the way, this is all virtual. At this point in time, I basically got to the point in time where I was taking an hour lunch break. Google gives you like an hour lunch break to just go eat and think about how bad or great you've been doing so far. And that's what I did. I basically got lunch. I sat down. And I was just like in my feelings. I put on Drake, Marvin's Room, and I was just in my emotions, eating my lunch, just going like, damn, I'm really like dying today. So after that, I came back to the interview space, and I actually ended up doing a lot better from this point on. I mean, when you're at rock bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. So, that's kind of like, take that with a grain of salt. But the next problem I got was kind of like more of like a medium type of like leak code medium DFS problem. And I took the structural approach of like doing topological sort, although it wasn't a topological sort question. That's kind of the way I framed it in my mind. And I will mention that I made a mistake on this problem that I didn't think was a big mistake, but after getting feedback, I realize now that, like, I guess it is a negative. And that is that I made the problem a little bit more complicated by providing more information and saving more information. And what I mean by that is that this was, again, a DFS problem, and I used a recursive approach. And I also asked the interviewer, and I said, listen, like, you're asking me for some value. Like, say you have a bunch of nodes, and you want a node's value. Now, in order to find this node's value, you also need to know the value of all the other nodes. And I asked them, I'm like, does it make sense to save this in a map and basically, like, represent it like that you would return this node's information from within the map so that the map would have all the information. It would be a little bit more memory intensive, but it would also speed up the process for other items if you were to query it, and it would also just keep track of all the data. And I said, like, does that make sense? And he's like, well, this problem doesn't ask for that, but you could do that if you want. Now, I don't know what interviewers are supposed to do in terms of, like, warning you or, like, telling you, like, oh, you could do that, but you're going to take an L. But I made this design choice, and it was, like, a small change of using a map to cache items as well as add an if statement and, like, a set to ignore dupes. And I probably added maybe, like, one if condition, 2 lines of code. It wasn't anything that was gigantic. But the feedback I got is that I basically made the problem more complicated than it needed to be. I made the problem, like, more verbose. It was just more complicated than necessary. I guess. I mean, I literally, like, just put information in a map. I could have just used an integer and returned that single integer. But I didn't think it was going to be that negative because, like, from an interviewer's perspective, and again, this is very important, like, you should just do whatever your interviewer wants. If your interviewer said, use a map to cache items, use a map to cache items. If your interviewer says, like, yeah, you could do that, but I'm just looking for this, just give him what he's looking for because, in my experience, it basically ended up being a negative where it's like, okay, I don't care about that, why are you giving me this? And you're basically making this more complicated than it needs to be. So that round, although I did well and I gave an optimal solution because I made the design choice of using that map to cache information, it basically ended up being a light hire. Like, the guy was basically saying, like, okay, I would have said this was a hire, but because he had some complications and, like, it was a little bit more than it needed to be, I'm going to give it a light hire. So I was like, all right, at least that's something to take away from that. And then for my final coding round, it went really, really well. It was probably the best round just because of the fact that I saw the problem and I identified, like, what to do with it pretty quickly, even though I was kind of confused at first. I ended up eventually, for the initial part of this problem, I gave it n log n solution. The optimal solution would have been on, but I did n log n because I was trying to basically, at that point in time, from my perspective of that problem, it was a string manipulation problem. And it was basically dealing with limits of items, like in terms of some item that's within some range of another item. So I ended up using a tree map. And the tree map is what, it has a log n access, so that's what made it n log n. But in general, my interview seemed pretty happy with the implementation. It was a simple implementation, and it seemed to go pretty good. Then he gave an extension to the problem, and this extension to the problem basically was a little bit different than the original problem, where now, instead of it having be all the data set provided to you, it's a streaming context, where you're basically getting a string chunk by chunk, and you basically have to deal with those chunks the same way you did in the previous problem, except now obviously you don't have all the data. So what I ended up doing was kind of like a sliding window implementation. I basically had an array DQ, then whatever I was like tending towards some limit and I went over it, I would just dump things off the window. And then if it was within some limit, I would basically save it in local memory. I was basically just using a hash map. And after I did that problem, I realized like for the previous problem, I could have done the same exact thing because both were, it's basically the same implementation. It's just one has all items in memory. I mentioned that to my interviewer, but I don't know if that matters. Like my first solution was n log n, not on, so I don't really know if that's like, oh, okay, he saw that, let's give him extra points. No idea. Surprisingly, I was kind of surprised because for this interview, it seemed to go pretty well for the first part of the problem, and then for the second part of the problem with the extension, he said it was really good. The way I did it was right, and he also said that with what I had done, basically, he was like, oh, some candidates missed this, you didn't miss this, I'm happy you did that, that's really good. So I was thinking in my head, I'm like, damn, like, this guy loves me, like, this guy's going to be, like, in that room telling everyone, like, telling the first two interviewers that said I'm probably stupid, he's like, nah, this guy's a god, he's amazing. But for this interview, I got the feedback that it was, like, another light hire, so it wasn't, like, a strong hire, it was just, like, a light hire. So, again, it's better than the first two, but I was kind of surprised because I thought I did everything correctly. So I don't know what constitutes a strong hire. I guess if you get the absolute most optimal problem, and I don't know, like I have no idea. I kind of felt like I kind of felt a little blindsided by that because I felt like the interview went really well. And then for the last part of the interview, now this doesn't really matter, and the only reason I say that is because even as the feedback, they don't bring it up. They're not like, oh, you did good on the behavioral. It's just whatever. I think they use the behavioral just to see if you're a jerk or not. And I think that, I passed it in terms of the questions that were given and the information and different hypotheticals. And all in all, I'd say, obviously my first two interview problems didn't do amazing in. Had the non-optimal solution for one and then a partial solution for the other. Third interview did a lot better, but again, I had that feedback in terms of, making it a little bit more complex than it needed to be. The last interview, the only thing I can think of, honestly, is that, maybe there's like some bug in terms of the streaming context I'm missing. Because the interviewer said I did a good job, so like I'm thinking like maybe after the fact or something he saw, and also the fact that I had an n log n solution for something that could have been on, which for those last two ended up being in a light hire. So again, it's better than like a no hire or a light no hire, but still a little bit worse than I was expecting. I was expecting to get rejected, and for the recruiter to be like, okay, you had a no hire, light hire, or a strong hire for the last one, and this is just not enough to continue on, blah blah blah. But it ended up being a lot more like lukewarm for the things I thought I did good in, and then for the things I did bad in, it was kind of what I expected. But overall, it was a pretty good interview experience. I think there's a common practice at Google that once you have a interview, you could come back in a year, you skip the phone screen, and you could try again. I may or may not do that. If I do, I probably would study up until then. In terms of advice for myself and anyone else that may be curious in this process, I definitely would recommend you take 3 to 4 weeks to just study, especially if you're working. Like for me, I basically had like 3 hours a night, and then maybe I don't know, like maybe 8 hours on the weekend. And I'm gonna be honest with you, for me personally, I feel like I was in the right mind space coming into this interview. Because not to say that I have anything against Google, I would absolutely love to work there, and I have nothing against them. But again, it came in at such a time that where I had basically done all my interviews, I was at the end, and I was like, damn, like if it was any other company, I would have told them like, no, I have offers, I'm not going to do this. But because it was Google, I was like, damn, I should at least open up a network connection here, and I should at least like try. And I think it was a good learning experience. It was something that was a positive as opposed to a negative. And I think that in the future, I'll definitely be a little bit more careful in terms of what I study and how I study. And for me personally, like I said, my biggest weakness right now is dynamic programming. And I was actually planning on doing this course that this guy on LeetCode suggested. It's called Algorithms and Specialization. I don't know if I will get a lot of value from everything from this, but I definitely need help in dynamic programming because, I don't know, I took discrete structures in college and I did well in it, but I guess I didn't really click with the whole creating the problem, because I know a lot of times people look at dynamic programming as something that's related to discrete structures, But I personally view it more in line with differential equations, where like how you create your own differential equation. You're given some problem, and then you have to create a function, and then basically either integrate or derivate on that problem. And I sucked at that. I always would like struggle so much. And I think I feel the same way with dynamic programming. So that's personally something that I need to work on. But I would say that, if you have a Google interview and it's coming up, or if you're interested in the process, at the end of the day, like, it's Google, it's a big company, and even for me, like, that first question, like, completely floored me, because there's only so much preparation you can do in terms of, like, programming, but now I have to focus on calculus and geometry. And again, that problem was not hard. That was something that you would take, like, first, 2 weeks in your Calculus 3 course. But, like, there's only so much I can study and so much I can focus on. But I would say that the interview was actually a little bit more digestible than I was expecting. I was expecting, honestly, to go in there and get completely bodied, get everything right, or get everything wrong. But, even the first two problems that I didn't know, I tried my best. I tried to solve it as much as I could. I didn't just sit there and go hamna, 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 hamna the whole time. And I think for the last two problems, I definitely was more comfortable with it. And I think that I did get a takeaway of, I think for the future, I should definitely be a little bit more vocal in my interviewer and just say, like, does this look good to you? Do you think this is unnecessary? And I think I might actually even be, like, blunt honest and say, listen, like, last time I did this ended up being negative feedback, and I'm trying to avoid that. And honestly, I don't know if interviewers are supposed to tell you info like that. I almost always never, ever ask them questions about the interview. Like, I'll do the problem, and then after the interview, I'll just ask about the work experience. I have no idea if it's better to ask about the problem and the different items of the problem. I've never done that. I've just, like, everywhere I've interviewed, I've done the problem, whether it was good or bad, and then I just would quickly ask them about their work experience, because that's what I'm most interested in. Because, like, the problem is the problem. Like, there's only so much you're going to learn, but I would like to know about their work experience and what they've done. But either way, kind of rambling on. Google, surprised I was able to get an interview. I did pretty well. It wasn't anything amazing. At least I got past the phone screen, right? I mean, I did something right along the lines. I definitely would recommend that, you study beforehand. I definitely would recommend you check out sites like Team Blind and Leak Code, and, take your time and take into consideration the level that you're going to interview for, as well as what you want to study. So for me, like, say if this interview had system design, I probably would have focused on dynamic programming and system design the most, but, ended up being just mostly dynamic programming for me in terms of things that I'm not really familiar with. But in general, positive experience. Hopefully, in the future, if I ever get the opportunity to do it again, hopefully I do better. Yeah, I went to a Google interview. I got rejected, and hopefully I'll learn from this experience.